All right, so we finally reached the end of our long set of videos on medieval Europe. So we've looked at the Byzantine Empire, we've looked at Western Europe, and now we're going to kind of put the two pieces together and talk about the Crusades. So the Crusades are a really, really complicated issue. It's very difficult to talk about this in one short video like this, so this is just going to be a very brief overview of what the Crusades are. So if we define what the Crusades were, these were a complicated economic, political, and religious conflict between Western Europe, directed by the Pope, versus the Abbasid Caliphate, led mostly by the Seljuk Turks. Now, we can also see this as a response to a lot of the stuff we've been talking about over the last few videos. So we could see this as a response to the Great Schism, we can see it as a response to Abbasid victories against the Byzantines. And we can also kind of see it as a response to the inflexibility of the feudal system and the various social hierarchies in Western Europe. So there is a lot of stuff going on here. And in some ways, we're still dealing with the consequences of the Crusades even right now. So let's jump in and see why this started to happen. So if you remember back to when we were talking about the decline of the Byzantine Empire, the Seljuk Turks took over the caliphate, and then they started taking lots of Byzantine territory. And we kind of gave an example of that in 1071 with the Battle of Manzikert. So the Seljuk Turks are seemingly unstoppable at this point. They took over the caliphate, and now they're running the caliphate. They're taking lots of Byzantine territory, and now they are in complete control of Anatolia, the heartland of the Byzantine Empire. So In response to this, the Byzantine emperor reaches out to the Pope for help. And the Pope agrees. The Pope agrees to help. Now, you might think that the Pope is doing this for altruistic reasons, that he just wants to help the Byzantine emperor out, but that might be part of it, but it's not the whole story. The Pope sees this as a way to expand his own power. The Pope sees this as a way to expand his own power. And he can do this in a number of ways. He can heal the Great Schism and bring the church back together. He can unite the kings and the militaries of Western Europe under his authority. And he can also make Europe a little less violent by sending all the violence to the Middle East. People fought all the time in Western Europe, and he thought that maybe I could just take all that violence and put it in the Middle East so that it makes Europe look a lot more peaceful. So to do all this stuff, the Pope calls his allies. He calls his allies together in 1095. And rallies them to save fellow Christians and save the Holy Land from the Muslims. It's unclear how much of this he actually believes, but he keeps most of his motivations to himself. So these things to himself. So he doesn't tell everybody about those things. He really just gets everybody on board by saying, we're going to go save our fellow Christians. We're going to save the Holy Land from the Muslims. And everyone is really excited to do this. So everybody that gets involved in the Crusades, or at least this first crusade, is doing so for many different reasons. Everybody is doing this for a different reason. Generally, like I said earlier, Europe is really violent, and everybody is excited to go do some violence. So this kind of unites all the Crusaders. So they all want to go get into a big fight. The kings, they want to get on the Pope's good side. Regular people go to maybe get some land, or some money. Because remember, social mobility is pretty much impossible, and this is a rare opportunity to get some land. And even people at the very bottom of society, even the people at the very bottom of society, like criminals, want to go, because if they go, their sins will go away. So if they go, their sins are wiped away. So even if they die in the fighting, they get to go to heaven. So everybody in society is super excited to go do this. And one of the cool end results of this is that the Pope was right. Europe is peaceful for a while. Europe is quiet. All the rowdy people have left. It's the caliphate's problem now. Here's one more thing that we should keep in mind before we actually talk about the crusade. No one cared that the Holy Land was controlled by Muslims until just now. Because they had been controlled by Muslims, the Holy Land had been controlled by Muslims for like the last 400 years, and nobody cared until just now. So, without getting into the events of the First Crusade, somehow, unexpectedly, the crusade was successful. No one is exactly sure why it was successful, but unexpectedly, to everyone's surprise, the Europeans were successful. So the First Crusade goes from 1095 to 1099. And the Europeans set up small feudal kingdoms around the city of Jerusalem. Now, to no one's surprise, there were more Crusades. More Crusades happened. They happened about every 50 years. So the Second Crusades was around the 1140s. So they happened about every 50 years or so. And it just so happens that about every 50 years there are new kings and new popes and new criminals. And everyone just wants Europe to be quiet again for a little while. But the objective is always the same. The objective is always save or protect the Holy Land, or sometimes alternatively attack rich Islamic places. Most of these are completely unsuccessful. There are little victories that they might have along the way, but generally speaking, every crusade was a failure. There were 7 official crusades. These are the ones that are called by the Pope. There are also lots of unofficial crusades that were just called by regular people. But generally speaking, whether they were official or not, they were all pretty unsuccessful. Now, I did promise when we talked about the collapse of Constantinople, I did promise we would do a little bit more on the Fourth Crusade. So here's a little bit more on the Fourth Crusade. So the Crusaders managed to get to Constantinople. But they ran out of money. So the Crusaders managed to get to Constantinople, but ran out of money. So they asked the Byzantine emperor if he would pay to send them to the Holy Land. He agreed with a condition. He agreed, but the Crusaders had to go stop a rebellion for him. And they said sure. So they had a deal. So they go stop the rebellion. And while they're gone, The old emperor was overthrown, and the new emperor refused to honor the deal. So the Crusaders sacked the city. The Fourth Crusade was the Crazy Crusade. Now, the Crusades are a lot more complicated and there are a lot more details to all the different Crusades, but for our purposes, let's talk about the consequences of the Crusades. And there are several. One is that it unified the Christians, or it unified the Europeans under a single Christian banner. So all the different Europeans are kind of unified as Christians. It brought back Greek and Roman philosophy from the Middle East that had been ignored or forgotten about in Europe. And this is what's going to kind of form the intellectual basis for the Renaissance. It's also going to solidify trade routes between Italy and the Middle East, which is going to provide the economic basis for the Renaissance. It's going to weaken the authority of the Pope because generally the Crusades were all failures and they were his idea. And it's going to lead to a lasting animosity between Christians and Muslims. And in that sense, we're still dealing with the consequences of the Crusades today. Now, one more kind of related idea to the Crusades is this concept called the Reconquista. And it's related to the Crusades in this way. The Christian zeal, like the enthusiasm to expand and attack Muslims helped the people of Spain, the Spanish people, to unify. So the Spanish were not unified. There were little Spains, like we talked about, little Germanys. The Christian zeal to expand and attack Muslims helped the Spanish people to unify and push the Muslims off the Iberian Peninsula, which is the peninsula that Spain and Portugal are on. So, technically speaking, this process starts with the Battle of Tours in 734. But it really gains momentum in the 1200s, and it's finally going to finish in 1492. So this is a slow, gradual process that takes about 750 years to finish, but this is what creates the Spanish idea of their people. This is the idea of the Spanish people, and it starts here with the Reconquista. We're going to come back to this quite a bit when we talk about European exploration, because once the Spanish are successful in pushing the Muslims out of Spain, they still want to expand Christianity. And so they're going to start getting on boats and exploring the world to see where else they can expand Christianity to. But we're not there yet. We'll worry about that in time period 4. So this kind of marks the end of our stuff on Europe in time period 3. So until our next set of videos, which I believe will be on the Mongols, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.